Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mormonish. I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Landon.
And we have a wonderful returning guest who has been with us before. We have the incredible Lee Krähenbühl. How are you today, Lee?
I am very well. Thank you very much. And everybody looks well. And I am really happy to be played in by such perky music. When I am down, when I am in a bad mood, I put on one of the episodes of the Mormonish podcast and just kind of do a little seat dance.
Yeah, it's funny because people either love that intro or they hate it. We've gotten emails about both. Some people say, I love this. It's so fun and perky. Other people say, I can't stand this. It's like a tacky commercial jingle or an old sitcom.
I'll tell you what it reminds me of. One of my favorite songs in the world used to be a cheese commercial. And it's a commercial that was written that was performed by a group called Mother Mother, and it's called Bright Idea. And you would know it immediately if you heard it. But that's what the Mormonish theme song reminds me of. So it makes me happy to be here, and thanks for your gracious invitation.
We ought to rewrite the Mormonish episode with Lee's voice. He's got that Marvin Gaye deep bass. Right. We could have kind of a sexy introduction. Mormonish at night.
Maybe we'll have to follow after Mormonism After Dark, which is RFM and Bill's show, and do Mormonish After Dark. I can't even imagine what that would be like. We don't stay up that late. I don't know. All right. Well, why don't we have Lee? You have been a guest before, but why don't you introduce yourself? Just in case this is the first time, we do have quite a number of new viewers and listeners since you were on last. And I'm going to link the past episode that you did with us in the show notes. So people are going to love this and they're going to say, we want more Lee. And so then they can go to the show notes. So why don't you introduce yourself a little bit, and then we'll dive right into what we're going to talk about tonight. It's going to be fascinating. We've kind of been working on this throughout the months of the summer, and things have finally settled down, and we have time to actually tape this. So we're excited.
Well, I'm excited too. Thank you very much. Back in episode 137, we were talking about the origins of Mormon theater and its confluences and its significance. And my name is Lee Krähenbühl. I'm the chair of communication at Stevenson University in Owings Mills, Maryland. And my research specialty is the confluence of entertainment and theater with religious groups in the 19th century. And it just so happens that the earliest English-speaking religious group to sanction theater as something that was acceptable to attend and to produce were the Mormons of Nauvoo, Illinois, in 1844. And what we were talking about in episode 37 was the fact that there seems to be a real lack of curiosity about what I think is a very important fact, and that is that the Latter-day Saints were the earliest group to employ theater. And this is an offshoot of that, because all of this happened in a very concentrated fashion in the summer of 1844. And this episode is about a search for the identity of one of the actresses of this troupe. And so the name of the episode is Solved: The Mystery of Miss Six Asterisks, a lost Nauvoo actress and wronged plural wife rescued from 180 years of obscurity.
I love this. And when you pitched this to me, how could anyone say no to that title? I mean, it just sounds absolutely incredible. And before we start, I have to say one of the most interesting things about you is that, you discovered a connection to Mormonism. You are not LDS at all. And yet you know so much, especially about the early history, and have a connection.
I do. I have 3 flavors of restoration theology on my father's mother's side of the family. And when I got interested in genealogy, I I discovered that I have a second great grandfather named Joseph Smith Lee. And what really astounded me was that he wasn't named Joseph Smith Lee because his father admired Joseph Smith. He was named Joseph Smith Lee because his father knew Joseph Smith. I am a distant cousin to Harold B. Lee. We have the same third great grandparents, and I discovered the significance of all of this when I was a young theater historian in my 30s. And if we can go ahead and share the screen, I'll talk a little bit more about that before we begin.
Yeah, we've got
going. I love theater and I love to talk about Mormonism. So when the two converge, it's wonderful.
This sounds like Secret Mormon Wives 1844 version. Is that what we're going to get here?
Secret Mormon Wives.
Secret Lives of Secret Mormon Wives.
You could not have given us a better entree into our subject today, because that's exactly what we're talking about. And I'll just let's see. Am I shared?
You are. Yep.
I think you're shared.
Let's see. I am shared. Okay, wonderful. Well, let's go ahead and I first of all, this is of course Edgar Allan Poe. I'm municipally obligated to throw a Poe reference into everything I do because I work in Baltimore County. So this is my Poe reference. Just to say, the reason that I'm debuting this information here on Mormonish is that it's really refreshing to talk with folks who actually care about the subject matter. And that makes our discussion different from the more formal and, frankly, the stuffier presentations that I have to make at scholarly conferences, which only allow presentations for 8 minutes, usually, sometimes up to 20. This is a very rare opportunity for long-form storytelling, which I think those of us who listen to a lot of podcasts are really, really into. Yeah. And this just doesn't exist in academic meetings. And those are ruled by, the kind of time constraints that I just talked about, or in academic publishing, which is ruled by editors who have to think about space limitations and publishing budgets and whether they can sell books and things like that. And since we last talked back in episode 137, I've learned from our mutual friend, the marvelous Maven Brody, that I fall into the category of something called Never Mormon.
That's right.
Or
Never Rebecca, Mo, or No Mo. There's all kinds of names.
Right. So this is my Poe reference. So to get the first dad joke of the evening out of the way, there will be many more. Quoth the Raven.
Nevermore.
Nevermore, man.
Nevermore, man. There we go.
So that's me. That's me. This reference is most appropriate because Edgar Allan Poe invented a whole literary genre single-handedly when he wrote his novel The Murders in the Rue Morgue in 1841. And that was the first detective novel. And what we're going to be discussing today is likewise a detective story that also has its origins in the early 1840s. In fact, we are going to solve a Jane Doe case. We're going to look for someone's true identity, obscured for 180 years. We're going to sift through the details of the case step by step, carefully examining each piece of evidence. And I should review how I came to this information as a scholar. Then, as now, I was a Never Mormon, a young theater historian, or a younger theater historian over 30 years ago when I first visited old Nauvoo, Illinois at the Tourist, and I had some vague awareness that I had some Mormon ancestry way back on my paternal grandmother's side. And I grew up in a California town with a prominent LDS presence. 2 of my high school friends are now bishops in Utah, which I'm sure they would appreciate me not mentioning. Back in episode 137, we talked about what I discovered, that there were theatrical performances in this building here, the Masonic Hall in Nauvoo, Illinois, in April and May of 1844. Now, the LDS calls it the Cultural Hall, but it was built as a Masonic Hall. It was used as a municipal building as well, and it was never referred to as the cultural hall at any time before the middle of the 20th century. And these presentations that we're talking about in 1844 by a company of Latter-day Saints were the earliest theatrical productions sanctioned by any English-speaking religious community in America. Other religious denominations would not follow suit for another 40 years, but information about these productions was really scarce. Nobody who was, none of the dear missionaries who were stationed in the cultural hall, first of all, could tell me why it wasn't the Masonic Hall. And they also didn't know any of the names of the peoples on the poster that we're about to look at, other than the ones who are prominent in Mormon history, like Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, Amos Lyman, Erastus Snow. They didn't know about these folks. George A. Smith was also in the play. And all of this information has always been available, but until the internet, it wasn't terribly easy or convenient to find. So I'm currently writing a book about it in the form of a biography. I'm calling it Joseph's Actor, Rediscovering the Life of Tragedian Thomas A. Line, 1806 to 1890, accidental father of theater and elocution among the Latter-day Saints. This is Mr. Line. This is a daguerreotype that was taken in 1869, and you can find this online anywhere. It's one of 3 images of him that exists. He started his career in 1829, and when he died in 1890, he was the oldest actor in America, according to the records of people who keep track of such things. And as I shared last time, I'm still astonished at the level of disinterest among LDS scholars about how significant these performances were. And that disinterest shows itself in the blatant erasure of important people from the official LDS historical record. Take, for example, this article. It's called The Salt Lake Theater, Brigham's Playhouse. It's part of a book called Salt Lake City, the Place Which God Prepared, by Scott Esplin and Kenneth Alford. They were the editors of this compendium of articles. And you can find this at the publicly accessible web link that's listed here, and that is going to be listed. Can we list that on the show site as well?
Oh yeah, we can certainly put those links in the show notes.
Let us do that. It's a well-written and a concise article by 2 historians whom I admire very much. But when we look closely, we begin to notice some really strange omissions. Under the section titled A Rich Dramatic Tradition, you just scroll a little bit down in the page, we read, and I quote, "Drama and the arts were well established among Latter-day Saints before their arrival in the Western Desert. In Nauvoo during the 1840s, the Saints embraced the notion that a reprieve from the daily struggle of living was indispensable to their mental and spiritual health," end quote. Well, so far, so good. But now we begin to get into trouble with the historical facts as we read the next sentence, which begins, "The prophet Joseph Smith led the effort to encourage such interest by organizing a dramatic company in Nauvoo," end quote. This is a legend that only began in the early 20th century, around 1916, and it is blatantly false. Joseph Smith did not organize a dramatic company, and anyone who has ever organized one and then looked at the chronology of Joseph Smith's daily activities in his journals and in the history of the church will quickly realize that he simply did not have the time to do any such thing.
Even as he had that.
Yeah.
How could he possibly?
Well, the answer to that is he didn't.
He didn't.
And you don't have 37 wives and start a theatrical company.
Unless you put them all in the play. That's the only way it would work. But then there'd be all that cat fighting, who gets the lead, who's the understudy.
That's the thing. The casting, putting the casting list up alone would have been just draining.
Exactly.
And now in the very next sentence, we have a second difficulty. And the quote is, "The multi-story cultural hall, also known as the Masonic Hall." We pause in the quote to point out that, yes, the building is now called the Cultural Hall by the LDS, which now owns it. if you have a chance to visit old historic Nauvoo, you'll see this sign out front. Let me get it up on the slide here. It declares it to be the cultural hall, but as far as I can tell, that wasn't the designation until 1971, when the corporation that then was called Nauvoo Restoration Incorporated. It's changed its name. It's been disbanded and changed its name. But it was built as the Masonic Hall. It was advertised as the Masonic Hall when the performances took place there, and it wasn't called the Cultural Hall until the middle of the 20th century, when the LDS was taking particular pains to expunge references to the connection between Mormon theology and Freemasonry from the historical record. So we resume the quote. The multi-story Cultural Hall, also known as the Masonic Hall, was built on Main Street in the early 1840s, and numerous plays were performed there. Notice the passive voice. Numerous plays were performed there. In April 1844 goes the quote, just 2 months before the martyrdom of Joseph and Hiram Smith, Brigham Young appeared in 2 scenes of the play Pizarro, or The Death of Rolla, as the high priest, costumed in robes of scarlet and gold with white muslin in a non-speaking part. That is completely true. Also in that same Nauvoo production of Pizarro, the phrase continues, a young man named Hiram Clausen accepted a small part as a stagehand. He later played a major role in creating and establishing the Salt Lake Theater, end quote. Now, this entire passage raises a really important question. Why is this written in the passive voice? That is, numerous plays were performed there. Who put them together? Who directed them? Who starred in them?
Line.
Yeah, Brigham. Yeah, exactly. Brigham Young and Hiram Clausen are important figures in Mormon history. But so were other people in the play. George A. Smith was in the play. Heber C. Kimball was in this production of Pizarro. Amos Lyman was in this production of Pizarro. Erastus Snow. Clausen and Brigham Young were very minor participants. Members of the LDS produced, directed, and starred in these plays. One of them, Thomas A. Line, was a famous professional actor at the time. We know who these people are. Why have they been erased?
I have a theory, if I can interject.
Please do.
I believe that the LDS Church does not want any of their members imagining that some of their founding fathers of Mormonism were engaging in make-believe. You might take that further and consider some of the other aspects of early Mormonism, make-believe, perhaps. I just don't think it's a serious look for these gentlemen. I think that they cannot go there with the fact that they performed endowment plays and some of them slithered on the floor like a snake. And it also makes you picture all of them as young, exuberant youth. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And that it does not give the weight and the ponderance that you need to start a religion, a global faith.
We can make believe.
Yeah, exactly.
I love you.
I love it. You burst into song like I do. So
I do.
Do you see what I'm saying, Landon? I just don't think that you're not supposed to picture them like that.
Well, and I also think that if you picture that the leading men, I guess, I don't think there was any women in here, but the leading men of Nauvoo were performing plays in the Masonic Hall, Masonic Temple. That gives a lot of credence to the plays in the Temple of Nauvoo were really based on Masonry and drama, just like the plays they were putting on there. Yeah.
Role-playing.
Yes.
Yeah.
In point of fact, if we go back to episode 137, what happened was each of these fellows here, and there were women, by the way. Clarissa Young, Brigham Young's wife, was in the productions, and several of the actresses we're about to talk about. But here we have kind of a symbology of who was in senior LDS leadership. That's the is that Moroni?
Yeah,
that's Angel Moroni.
Okay,
yeah.
Angel Moroni. That's that symbol.
Oh, okay, I see. This is a great chart.
So you've got these, theater,
okay,
church,
each
Mason,
of these,
and
each of these folks was a Freemason.
Okay.
Okay.
And that's the compass and the square representing Freemasonry.
Yes, exactly. The temple figure, the temple symbol, marks each of these men who was one of the first enactors in the play that is the temple endowment.
Right. The sacred ceremony. And isn't that interesting? Look how many people have the comedy tragedy mask there, meaning they're just an actor in the community and they're just an actor in the temple, except for they're in the temple. That's what God wants you to do. It's a very solemn, sacred ceremony, completely different from what you might do over at the Masonic Hall. See, that's the connection I don't think they want regular members to make.
Yes, I think there is something in that. It's interesting to see how that evolved because there's an historian in the 1880s named Edwin Tullidge. You may have heard of him. I encourage everybody to read Edwin Tullidge's works, particularly the history of Salt Lake City. But it was Edwin Tullidge who said that the theater is as orthodox as the temple, and that Thomas A. Line was Joseph's actor, which is where I get the title of the book that I'm writing. Edwin Tullidge has fallen out of favor because Edwin Tullidge was a Godbeite.
Founder of the Salt Lake Tribune.
That's
founder
right.
of the Salt.
He was the
founder of the Salt Lake Tribune. Among the Godbeites was also Amos Lyman.
That's right.
And Thomas A. Line became a Godbeite when he got to Salt Lake City.
Yep. And this is a group who parted with traditional Mormonism and sort of became more spiritualists. And they had some different ideas and were definitely at odds with the leadership. And Amasa he was an apostle, wasn't he, when he became a Godbeite, or he was a church leader?
By the time he became a Godbeite, there's a period between 1869 and 1871 where everybody's having problems with Amos Lyman. And the reason being that while he was down in San Bernardino, he started practicing spiritualism, and he started staging seances. And this was something that was being done an awful lot. And when spiritualism swept into Salt Lake City after the Civil War, the leadership finally needed to do something about it. And this was especially awkward because there was a group of actors about whom I have done presentations before over on Radio Free Mormon. There was an actor, a group of actors called Carter's Dramatic Combination, who believed that they were being spoken to through the use of a spiritual planchette, what we would recognize these days as a Ouija board, through automatic writing. And they were being told by this planchette to walk through the desert all the way from Los Angeles to Salt Lake City and be baptized by Brigham Young.
Of course.
This was a surprise to Brigham Young when they all showed up. And Brigham Young, let's be clear about Brigham Young's stance on spiritualism. It was not that Brigham Young did not believe that there were spirits who spoke to people. He simply believed that they were demons. But if they were spirits who were telling this group of actors to come and be baptized by him, well, they must be okay. So what he did was baptize them, put them in the company of the Salt Lake Theater that he had just built, or that he had built in 1862. And in 1871, they were all immediately on stage. Jared Carter, Harry Carter, Edward Marden, and W.J. Cogswell. And those four actors were baptized into the Latter-day Saints. It's an interesting little confluence that Harry Carter was the ex-wife of Thomas A. Line. As a matter of fact, she had left Thomas A. Line for Jared Carter. That's a whole nother story that we can pick up at another time, because that too is a fascinating soap opera.
Yeah, it is all soap opera. That's what I've learned.
Yeah.
I did look up Amasa Lyman was an apostle. He was also in the first presidency with Joseph Smith.
Thinking. It was kind of a big deal.
He had been, but by the time he got to Salt Lake City, all of these rumors about him being spiritualist were coming to light, and he was admonished and said, don't preach that. And he went ahead and preached it anyway, and then he was disfellowshipped. And so for the rest of his life, he lived in, I believe he lived into, no, I don't have his dates there. I believe he lived until the same year that Brigham Young died, 1877. And he was a spiritualist to the end of his life. He and Tom Line and a number of other folks who were involved in the spiritualist movement would meet every year and commemorate the founding of the spiritualist movement long after the Godbeites had splintered and disappeared as any kind of force within the city. But what I'd like you to be my fellow detective as we examine this case. We have a group of subjects and a group of witnesses to consider. Our subjects include 3 Nauvoo actresses, known respectively as Miss Goodnell, Miss Adams, and the woman whose identity we are solving in the course of our discussion, heretofore known only by the use of 6 asterisks to represent the letters of her last name. And to solve the mystery, we will call on the written testimony of 4 witnesses. Heber Chase Kimball, one of Joseph Smith's closest and most trusted advisors, his 15-year-old daughter, Helen Mar Kimball, who at the time, unbeknownst to anyone except herself, her parents, and Joseph Smith, was one of Joseph Smith's clandestine polygamous wives, with her father's full consent. She was 15, by the way. And then Caroline.
That's such a huge sticking point with Mormons. Just shy of her 15th birthday is how they say it. That's right.
Over that, yeah. So Caroline Eliza Youngs Adams, one of Kimball's converts to the Latter-day Saints, and a young non-Mormon visitor to Nauvoo, Illinois in 1843 named Charlotte Haven, and a theatrical reviewer for a local newspaper whose byline was the pseudonym "A Friend to the Drama." Now, every detective story has its villain, and ours is a man named George Jones Adams. Adams is actually pretty well documented in American history, but between 1840, when he became a Latter-day Saint, and his death in 1880. He appeared in 2 books as a figure by Mark Twain. One is The Innocents Abroad, in which Twain recounts the disastrous results of Adams' believers in a church of Zion that he tried to found in Jerusalem. Twain apparently witnessed Adams's acting in his boyhood as well in some Mississippi River town between Hannibal, Missouri, and Dubuque, Iowa, sometime between 1844 and 1852. And Sam Clemens fictionalized it in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which lampoons Adams as the campy, incompetent actor known as the Duke. And Adams is prominent in several books since, the most recent from 2020, Miles Harvey's magnificent book called The King of Confidence, about the Strang movement, and George Adams, after the assassination, after the martyrdom of the Smiths, became the right-hand man of James Jesse Strang. But even Adams's most careful biographer, and he has a wonderful biographer who's been working on him for 40 years. Reed Holmes has written 2 books about Adams, but even Holmes is forced to throw up his hands and gloss over large gaps in our knowledge about him, because details of his life before 1840 are scarce. We know he was born in Oxford Furness, New Jersey in 1810 or 1811 or 1813. He had a wife named Caroline Youngs and sisters named Margaret and Mercy. He and Caroline lived in Boston for a time before 1840, where he had experience as a tailor and a sometime actor. And significantly, George J. Adams also became a Methodist evangelist. Now, nothing about Adams was modest, extroverted, blustering, ready to quote either scripture or Shakespeare for hours on end. He was a born performer. But George's chief talent was mastery of the confidence game, to win the trust of those around him, and then to capitalize upon that trust until his deceit was discovered, whereupon he would deny all wrongdoing and he would move on to his next opportunity. And this was as true of his closest personal relationships as it was of his professional transactions. Adams's performances were so convincing that he came to believe them himself, costing those who trusted him their careers, their fortunes, and sadly, even their lives. He once faked his own death by placing an obituary in national newspapers in order to attempt a clean slate. In an era where you could do that. If you really wanted to disappear, you could disappear.
That's great.
Yeah. Now, at some point before 1840, George and Caroline Adams moved from Boston to New York, and Mormon evangelist Heber C. Kimball arrived there in New York on Sunday, February 16th, 1840. Road-weary and bleary-eyed, Kimball preached to a gathering of around 150 people. And what George J. Adams was doing in that congregation is something Adams never explained, but Kimball's sermon impressed him deeply. Later that year, Adams wrote that he believed the Mormon gospel as soon as I heard it and have never doubted it since, end quote. Adams's rise up through the ranks of Mormondom was meteoric, and it was startling. Only 8 days later, Kimball not only baptized him a Latter-day Saint, but on the following Sunday, March 1st, George was elevated to the status of elder, called by the spirit of prophecy by Elder Kimball and ordained by Elder Parley P. Pratt just prior to the time that the former two sailed for England. Proselytized the British, so impressed were they with Adams' enthusiasm and speaking skills. Now, at the time of his conversion and early success as a Mormon evangelist, George J. Adams was married to his wife of 10 years, Caroline Eliza Youngs. His sister, Mercy, was a professional actress married to a prominent tragedian named Thomas A. Line. It took Adams 4 full years to convert his brother-in-law to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, much to the horror of his sister Mercy, Line's wife. In the interim, Heber C. Kimball had conferred with his best friend, Brigham Young, and decided to call Adams to serve in the British mission where they had just been serving. And Brigham Young would later affirm that the doctrine of plural marriage had been revealed to him while in Britain. This brings us to a very important neighborhood in our story, Ironmonger's Row in London. Now, the first family, oh, by the way, once again, we have a public domain link. You can check it out. And it is, and you're going to need to help me with this. I asked Rebecca before, and she said, it really depends on who you ask.
It does.
But is this Ensign Peak or Ensign Peak?
Yeah.
What do you say, Landon?
They go both ways. I've heard it both ways.
Yeah, I think ensign is correct, but when I grew up, my family said ensign because we have a church magazine before they changed the name our whole lives. It was called, as my family called it, the ensign, but it's also the ensign. So any Mormon that you ask, you're going to get two different answers. Isn't that funny? Now they changed the name of the church magazine to the Liahona. There's no way to mispronounce that if you're LDS.
Oh, very good.
Liahona.
Well, yes.
Liahona.
Well,
yeah. I said if you're LDS.
this website is the ensign or ensign peak. Okay, I have something in the way of my slide there, but yes, it used to be the Mormon Historic Places website. Whatever it's called, you can find all this information in the public domain here. And the first family in London to be baptized Mormons were Henry and Mary Connor. And Henry Christophilus Connor was a watchmaker, and he opened his house at 52 Ironmonger Row for Wilford Woodruff, George A. Smith, and Heber C. Kimball to preach in. When Wilford Woodruff came home, he came home with a clock that still exists that was engraved as a gift to him from Henry Connor that Henry Connor had made. And George A. Smith and Heber C. Kimball preached there, and Connor became very close friends with Kimball, who mentioned him and his visits with the rest of the Connor family in his journal. You can also look that up. The book On the Potter's Wheel is basically the biggest chunks of Heber C. Kimball's journal. And the Connor family became so supportive of the LDS gospel that when the opportunity for the mission to house its evangelists across the street at number 40 Ironmonger Row came up, the directors of the mission leapt at the opportunity. Now, bear in mind that in 1840, we now have Mormon missionaries living across the street from the Connor family, because it will become very important piece of circumstantial evidence in our case. And now for a lot of information most of our listeners already know, but that most people did not at the time. It wasn't just architecture that was being built anew in Nauvoo. The institution of marriage as a whole was in fact being reconfigured there. Privately, among a strictly circumscribed group of Smith's senior advisors, it was called celestial marriage, or simply the principle. Once news of it began to leak to the general public, enemies of the Latter-day Saints called it spiritual wifery. The principle of plural marriage, as the restoration of marital modes in the Old Testament, may even have reached as far back as 1831 in Joseph Smith's Revelations, although owing to the fact that the practice was not public, this is far from clear. And because we don't have another 3 years to discuss the whole thing, we're just going to say Smith seems to have discussed plural marriage as a theory with his inner circle in the 1830s, and by the Nauvoo period, he was denouncing it publicly but practicing it privately. He introduced the concept as early as July of 1841 to his inner circle of advisors, the Quorum of 12, and among those advisors was Adams' mentor, Heber C. Kimball, whom Smith instructed on the practice in July of 1841. Right before Kimball returned to Britain, where George J. Adams was working on the English mission. The circumstances would seem to suggest that Kimball was so impressed with Adams' skill in evangelism in Brooklyn and then later in northern England that he took his protege into his confidence about the principle while George Adams was living across the street from the Connors. Kimball would learn to regret his candor. Of all Smith's inner circle and their lieutenants, the one least trustworthy with the confidentiality on the plural marriage principle was Lyne's brother, George J. Adams. Never the sharpest tool in the latter-day shed, Adams seemed not quite able to grasp the difference Smith struggled to draw, at least in word, if not in deed, between multiple wives on the one hand and multiple liaisons on the other.
And it's a
fine line.
Yeah.
It's fine, but we're all still trying to understand that about early church history.
Such a fine line.
Fine.
And I can't weigh in on it because I'm a never Mormon, but it seems a fine line. Rumors were swirling around George's conduct with one particular female parishioner in England even before he left. And it was this reckless behavior that would bring Adams back to Nauvoo in the spring to be disciplined for a second time by Smith's council. And ironically enough, that would finally bring Tom Line there, which brings us to the matter of Miss Asterisk. Drum roll, please. George J. Adams brought his entire family with him to Nauvoo. They boarded free of charge at Heber C. Kimball's house, much to the annoyance of Kimball's family, according to Kimball's daughter, 15-year-old Helen Mar Kimball. It's important that we hear Helen in a woman's voice. And Rebecca, I'm wondering if you would do the honor of reading us reading 1.
Yes, I love this. I have several parts I get to read here, and this is really fun because I miss the theater. So yes, this is Helen Mar Kimball, and she writes, George J. Adams took up his abode with us whenever he came to our city. He was there during the summer of 1843, at which time my father, being absent upon a mission, of course, made it rather hard for my mother to get along, as I went to school and she was obliged to hire a woman to do the work, her own health being very poor and her baby sick, which George Adams did not seem to realize, as he never offered any recompense. So her husband, Heber C. Kimball, is on a mission. This man is living in her home. She's having to hire help so that she can run the household, and George Adams seems oblivious. How interesting.
Yes. Understand also the additional family dynamic that Helen has now been claimed by Joseph Smith as a plural wife.
Yes.
Which Heber assents to. Of Violet, his public wife, his first wife, does not voice an opinion, a public opinion on this. But she's having a hard time with the fact that Heber is now accumulating plural wives of his own. All of this is weighing on Violet a great deal. Another fun fact about pronunciation of things in the LDS world. Violet's name is spelled V-I-L-A-T-E. It's clearly Violet because they were from Britain, and that was a British spelling of violet, as in the flower V-I-O-L-A-T-E, or phonetically, because Heber couldn't spell very well, V-I-L-A-T-E. And so when I went to Nauvoo and I went to the Heber C. Kimball house, which is it's one of the best preserved buildings there, and it's well furnished, and it's fascinating to be in there. But some of the rehearsals for the plays that we're going to be talking about were in this house. And so I said, did Violet Kimball write anything down about her experience in the house? And the missionary said, "You mean Volate?"
Yeah.
And I said, no, pretty sure it's Violet. Oh, no, it's Volate.
Yeah.
With the same assuredness that no, I'm pretty sure it was the cultural hall. So now the Adams family.
Well, I would say that Volate, as we've always learned it, sounds much more sophisticated than just Violet, right? Can't be just Violet. It has to be Volate. It's like a person I knew whose last name was but he pronounced it Boutte because it gave it more,
Did you ever see the series Keeping Up Appearances? And
yes.
Violet Buckle would pronounce her name Bouquet.
Yes, Bouquet. That's right. You can do anything you want. Maybe we should pronounce it Mormonish, something like that. But yeah, and I can see, I mean, because we've heard Violet our entire life. So Violet, that's not a person in church history. So that was probably shocking to them.
Fascinating. So the Addams family included not only George's wife, Caroline, but a toddler they introduced to everyone as their son. But there was a complication here. Anyone who was paying attention to the timeline of George's English mission would have known that Caroline had not accompanied him there, and would quickly have realized that it was not possible for the boy to have been parented by Caroline. Well, parented, but not born by Caroline.
Right.
And accompanying them was a young woman whom Adams said was his sister. Publicly, the newcomer was Miss Adams. In reality, she was not his sister, but the mother of George's child. That this was the worst kept secret in Nauvoo is attested to by a letter from Charlotte Haven, a non-Mormon young woman living in Nauvoo, to her relatives in the following fall of 1843. And Rebecca, would you read Charlotte's letter, reading 2?
Yes, here we go. And I guess she's sharing the juicy gossip, basically, of what's going on in Nauvoo. So she says, Nauvoo on September 8th, my dear friends at home, a month ago or more, one of the apostles, Adams by name, returned from a 2-year mission in England, bringing with him a wife and a child, although he had left a wife and family here when he went away. And I'm told that his first wife is reconciled to this certainty at first unwelcome guest in her home, for her husband and some others have reasoned with her that plurality of wives is taught in the Bible, that Abraham, Jacob, Solomon, David, and indeed all the old prophets and good men had several wives. And if right for them, it is right for the Latter-day Saints. Furthermore, the first wife will always be first in her husband's affection and the head of the household, where she will have a larger influence. Poor, weak woman. There you go. Everybody could see it, even back in the day. I cannot believe that Joseph will ever sanction such a doctrine. And should the Mormons in any way engraft such an article on their religion, the sect would surely fall to pieces. For what community or state could harbor such outrageous immorality? I love this girl. She's amazing. I cannot think so meanly of my sex as that they would submit to any such degradation. So she sees it. She calls it. She sees exactly what it is.
As did the Gentiles in Nauvoo. They weren't the only non-Mormons living in Nauvoo. There was a non-Mormon population there. And this is what the chatter was. And Charlotte Haven's letters have always been key artifacts of the Mormon Nauvoo era. For our purposes here, it's particularly important. Haven certifies that George Adams' adultery in England was not only public knowledge, but apparently had been, to coin a phrase, grandfathered in and retroactively regarded by Joseph Smith and his inner circle as a plural marriage. First, because Adams was an effective evangelist, and secondly, because if he apostatized, he could expose all of Smith's inner circle as polygamists, and all of this as early as 1843.
So basically, they grandfathered in his liaison in England and said, "Oh no, that's a plural. He's living the principle."
What happened was that his wife Caroline wrote a letter that we're about to get to, and that you're about to read. It's a long letter, and it's a rather desperate letter. But before we get to that, just as a sidebar about Charlotte Haven, here's another Mormonish podcast exclusive. I'm not aware of anybody who's written about what became of Charlotte Haven after she returned to her home on the East Coast. And I have since traced her through genealogical records and had a breakthrough in March, actually in June. And this is after you and I talked about the idea of this podcast, Rebecca. And I discovered that she married a man named Mason in Wisconsin. They had a very full life together on the frontier in the mountain states, and eventually they emigrated to the West Coast. And to my surprise and delight, on a trip this past spring to my family in San Jose, California, I discovered her grave. And it was a 10-minute drive from my brother's house.
Oh my God. That's crazy. What a journey.
Synchronicity. I think she wanted to be found.
That's amazing.
And I indulged in a selfie after paying my respects.
There she is.
So that's me with my Nauvoo
there you
shirt.
are.
There you go.
Well, that is some detective work, and what a life to visit Nauvoo, to be back in the East, then to end up and be buried in San Jose. Do you know the way to San Jose?
Yeah.
Charlotte did.
Well, she did, and I'm glad of it. She was a respected member of the community there when she died at a very advanced age. She died in 1900, so 18. Well, she was 80. She was 81. That's a good run. So I don't believe what eventually happened to Charlotte has ever been published before. So I offer it to you and to the podcast sphere, and all of which brings us back to the matter at hand, the identity of the actress identified only as Miss, followed by 6 asterisks. Now, this was a situation as brothers-in-law George J. Adams and Thomas A. Line prepared their production of Pizarro. The broadside marking the event pronounces Masonic Hall, Nauvoo, April 24th, 1844, will be presented a grand moral entertainment to aid in the discharge of a debt against President Joseph Smith, contracted through the odious persecution of Missouri and vexatious lawsuits. His friends and the public will respond to so laudable a call in patronizing the exertions of those who promise rational amusement with usefulness. The historical
fundraiser. It was a
fundraiser.
It was a fundraiser.
It was a fundraiser for Joseph Smith and the odious persecution, and all the apostles and the women in the town were in it.
It was. And this is very important for us to understand. We have this poster because it was preserved by somebody as an artifact in Missouri. In fact, it's the property of the Missouri Historical Society. There were posters like this for every play that they produced. This was the only one that was intended to raise money as a benefit for Joseph Smith. The actors who were gathered to do these plays were only those people who were willing to, and most people were not willing to, be on a stage, because it had never occurred to them that doing something so immoral, so pretentious, as we've noted, would be something that they would want to do. It was only when it was proposed by George Adams, who at the time was a respected evangelist. He only had a couple more years of that. And Thomas A. Line, who had just been baptized a Mormon. He was not an elder yet. He had been baptized in the Mississippi by Amasa Lyman. And all of this was to produce a play called Pizarro. We don't quite have time to get into the symbology of that play, but it was all about a small community, Incas, that was surrounded by Spanish conquistadors, meaning Gentile community. And Joseph Smith loved it, loved the play, came to see several of the other plays, was seen to have been moved by them. And here's part of the cast. We know that Brigham Young is playing the mute cameo role of the high priest, but where is George's sister, Miss Adams? Not in the play. And who is this other actress, Miss Goodnell? The plot thickens and the mystery deepens. But we're in luck. Anyone who says that we don't have enough evidence about this historic production in American history is just flat out wrong. The first play ever produced and sanctioned by any English-speaking religious community with the participation of professional actors was, as it turns out, reviewed by a local critic. And what's more, the review just didn't stay local to the Nauvoo area. The review made it all the way to the front page, center column of the morning edition of the New York Daily Tribune, co-edited by none other than 33-year-old Horace Greeley, who in the next 2 decades would exhort those seeking their fortunes to go west, young men.
Now, why would a review of a play in Nauvoo end up on the front page of the New York Daily Tribune? That's just so funny.
Because in 1844, before, the Mormon movement had picked up steam as a major American cultural phenomenon,
right.
because in June, notice this is June 5th, in
Of
spring of that year,
44.
Joseph Smith was running for president.
Right. That's right. Yep. And
He
this
and
is
Sidney
right
Rigdon,
before
who was the
he's
vice president.
killed. Yeah. This is all
Yes.
right there.
Yep.
So,
Yep. It is. There's so much very useful information in this review that it's worth reviewing the whole thing, which I will quote in its entirety with explanatory commentary. A new phase of Mormonism, holy theatricals. Holy theatricals. A correspondent of the Warsaw, Illinois Signal gives a most irresistibly ludicrous account of the introduction of the legitimate drama among the other performances, in italics, performances, farcical and otherwise, in the Holy City. It seems that the Nauvoo Theater is an establishment got up by the prophet for the, and again, the legend that he had anything to do with it, absolutely untrue. He didn't have anything to do with it except saying it's okay to do and going to a couple of the plays, for the purpose of enabling him to pay off some of the more pressing debts through the benefit of the acts of a company of players, exotic and indigenous. It was announced on the 25th, last 25th, they would favor the citizens of Nauvoo and vicinity with the celebrated tragedy of Pizarro, the death of Rolla, and the remarkable farce of John Jones of the War Office. It so happened, however, that on the evening mentioned, there came a terrible rainstorm, which prevented some of the actors from being there. This, however, did not prevent a large audience from attending, more particularly the ladies, who out of pure charity to Brother Joseph came flocking like doves to assist in his holy troubles. Some of them came in carriages, but others, not having the fear of mud before their eyes, came on foot, holding their dresses at half-mast for fear of getting them wet. On learning that the play would not come off that night, they repaired to the upper room of the Masonic Hall. Landon, I believe you've been there. Rebecca, you really do need to go to this building.
I do need to go.
Because they did have dances. They had quadrilles up in the, or cotillions up in the second story, which is also where they did Masonic rituals, whole nother thing. They repaired to the upper room of the Masonic Hall where they turned it off in a ball for the evening. On Friday evening, the first performance came off according to the appointment. At an early hour, His Highness the Prophet, accompanied by his attendants, made his appearance and took a seat in the chair of state, which was made expressly for the convenience of the Royal Highness. You can tell this is a Gentile writing. He seemed highly gratified at the able and dignified manner in which the performance was conducted by the Reverend gentlemen who took the leading characters in the play. Among the most conspicuous of the performers, I noticed Elders B. Young, Brigham Young, and G.A. Smith, George A. Smith, of the 12, and Reverend G.J. Adams of Spiritual Wife Memory. Just a sidebar, it's well known that he has more than one wife. That when he came to Nauvoo, it wasn't his sister who came with him and Caroline. It was his plural wives. Everybody knows it. Everybody knows it. We have no idea how this news got out. Maybe Caroline, because she was having such trouble with it, confided in someone to whom she should not have confided. Back to the text. Also, Elder Thomas A. Line, late supernumerary in the Park Theater of New York, who sustained the part of Rolla in a manner becoming the conspicuous place he lately occupied. That's a slap at Line that he had been a supernumerary in the Park Theater. In fact, he had had lead roles at the Park. He had acted opposite Edwin Forrest, Junius Brutus Booth, the father of the assassin, but a good friend of Thomas A. Lyne's. He had appeared opposite Charlotte Cushman, Mrs. John Drew. Every conspicuous actor you can possibly think of.
So you're saying he's slumming. He's slumming in Nauvoo.
Oh, and boy, did he know he was slumming in Nauvoo. And we're about to get to that too. On Friday evening, okay, let's see. The part of Alonzo was sustained by Elder Erastus Snow, a worthy preacher of the gospel. The part of Elvira was taken by Mrs. Adams, wife of the Reverend gentleman, that's Caroline, and that of Cora by his sister, Miss Adams. Now, this is confusing. It's confusing because Cora is billed on the broadside as being portrayed by Miss Goodnell. So it's very difficult to figure out what's going on here. In justice to the ladies, I must say they performed their parts extremely well, particularly Cora. We cannot refrain from mentioning that Alonzo's child was, meaning the toddler who was playing the part of Alonzo's child on stage, was one of G.J. Adams's spiritual babies by Miss, followed by six asterisks. Oh, shame, where is thy blush? Nothing remarkable happened during the performance of the tragedy. The farce also passed off very well, with the exception of the Reverend gentleman, who sustained the part of Guy Goodluck, Esquire, who was under the necessity of having his part read off him by the prompter. Okay, so I've highlighted these here.
So I can see why this made the front page, because this is hilarious. And there's so many little digs at Joseph and at spiritual wifery and the environment there. And I can see why there's a national appetite. This is very sensational and salacious.
Yep, absolutely. And it gets better. On Monday, the performance was advertised for that evening to be Therese, or the Orphan of Geneva, to be concluded with Pizarro. A large audience being in attendance, Elder Adams made his appearance and stated that in consequence of sickness in the family, they would not perform Therese that evening, but that Elder Line would favor the audience with the speech of Brutus over the dead body of Lucretia, and that the remarkable farce of John Jones of the War Office to conclude with Pizarro would be performed that evening. So we had a change of Pizarro and John Jones, and then John Jones and Pizarro. At the close of the evening's performance, it was stated by Elder Adams that the historical play Damon and Pythias and Therese would be performed on Wednesday, the 1st instant, and dismissed us with God's blessing. And that is the end of the review. Now, in order to understand fully what's going on in this situation, we have to go back 2 years to November of 1841, and we're going to play Where's George? Elder G.J. Adams had been serving the English mission for 18 months, having relieved Heber C. Kimball and Brigham Young. And Adams' wife, Caroline, had been waiting in New York, maintaining their home at 6 Charlton Street in Soho off 6th Avenue near Prince Street, anticipating George's return. He had been living in the Mormon missionary quarters near what is now number 1 Norman Street, adjacent to the home of London's first LDS converts, the Connor family, and George had become familiar with the family as Kimball had before him. Now, at first, George wrote to Caroline that he would be departing Liverpool on November 25th, 1841. A couple of weeks into December, he wrote to Caroline that the ship would be leaving on Christmas Day, 1841, and then January 1842 came and went. No George. He wrote next that the ship had been delayed to New Year's Eve due to inclement weather. Then the delay was extended to February 6th. Spring came, still no George. He gave storms as the excuse. Caroline must have wondered how George's ships could have been constantly driven back by gales, as he put it, yet his explanatory letters were still arriving over the same ocean. Finally, on April 6th, touche. Finally, on April 16th, 1842, George arrived suddenly at Caroline's door. I need not tell you how I was received by my family and friends in New York, George would write to the authorities in Nauvoo, as published in the Nauvoo Neighbor. Language cannot describe it. Indeed, no words could fully capture the consternation his April 16th return had caused, because George had told and would continue to tell so many lies and told them so inconsistently to so many different people that it proved difficult to reconstruct what actually happened. Even Adams's most careful and persistent biographer, Reed Holmes, simply threw up his hands and glossed over the whole matter of George's English misadventure and its aftermath. But over the last 30 years, more and more evidence has emerged through projects such as the Joseph Smith papers. And it appears that facts and events unfolded something like this, according to what I've been able to piece together.
What was his role in the church right now? He was an elder, a missionary. Was he in any other position of authority at this time?
He was in the circle, just outside the circle of 12.
Okay.
When they appointed the circle,
apostles, right. And then he was what? Okay.
Yes.
So you consider him a higher up in the church when all this is happening.
He is a way higher up in the church, except for the fact that he kept embroiling himself in these rumors,
right,
that turned out to be true. And let's see if you, let's see if you, my fellow detectives, agree on the following scenario. Now, when George finally arrived back in New York on April 16, 1842, Caroline was startled to see that her husband was not alone. Accompanying him was a young English woman who had spent the journey at sea disguised as a cabin boy, and she had an infant in her care. The woman's name was Mary Ann Connor, eldest daughter of the English mission's first London converts, Henry and Mary Connor. Heber C. Kimball, who was particularly close to the family and mentions them in his journal, had introduced George and the Connor family. Now, Mary Ann Connor's name was unknown for many years until, it was published by the Joseph Smith Papers Project as a note in the historical introduction to the letter that George Adams wrote in February 1843 saying, "Yes, I will come back and stand trial against the charges of adultery." Her name has been known this entire time. But it wasn't until the good folks at the Joseph Smith Papers Project put it forward. It's buried in a historical note, but it's still there. Now, count the number of letters in Connor.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
I was already doing that math. Yep.
Interesting. Those Joseph Smith papers, I am telling you.
I love them. Love them.
Heber C. Kimball would have known immediately who this was.
Yes.
Because he was familiar with the family.
Yeah.
And had introduced George, the higher up in the church, to the family, the first convert family. So there would be no question that George and the Connors' eldest daughter had, I don't know, best case scenario, spiritual wifery, worst case scenario, a liaison that resulted in a child. However you want
to imagine the conversation between George Adams and Heber Kimball.
Yes.
George.
Exactly. Seriously, George.
Seriously, George. So once Kimball had returned to America and been replaced by George, living across the street from the Connors on Ironmonger Row for 7 weeks, had proven to be all too intimate a proximity between Elder Adams, in his late 20s or early 30s, and his 23-year-old parishioner, Mary. And that intimacy had now produced a child. And George's explanations to Caroline and the Nauvoo neighbor about the 4-month delay in travel, and what he said in his letter to the neighbor was, quote, "I would be glad to give a full account of the circumstances," he ended up writing, "but that story would occupy too large a space." End quote. Indeed, that had begun to ring more than a little hollow. And at some point during that delay, the child had been born. Now, he was returned to New York, and George did not reveal the principle of celestial marriage to his wife Caroline. Instead, mindful that he had been sworn to secrecy about the principle, George tried to mansplain himself out of the situation by lying outright to Caroline and spinning the tale that Mary was a wayward convert abandoned by the father of the child. And George had brought Mary and the child with him out of great Christian charity. It was out of kindness, out of concern for the danger Mary was in, said George, that he had further allowed her to christen the child George Oscar Adams. And George, yeah. And George entreated Caroline to help him raise the child as the Adams' own. In this way, they could both save the honor of the new convert, Mary Connor, and quash any sense of impropriety on George's part. Surely Caroline could find it in her heart to adopt the innocent child with George, to give him a respectable home, and give Mary a fresh start in Nauvoo, where they were all to move. They would introduce Mary Connor to everyone not as the child's mother, but instead as George's sister. Drawing on his inexhaustible supply of biblical illustrations, I was about to say something else, we can even imagine George appealing to the example of Pharaoh's daughter, rescuing Moses from his basket of reeds on the Nile. Caroline, you can be a noble woman like Pharaoh's daughter. Now, it's true enough that Mary Ann Connor was in desperate straits. The 1841 census of London showed her living apart from her parents in a Tottenham Place boarding house near St. Pancras. And it may be inferred either that Henry and Mary had put her there when she was discovered to be pregnant to save them the social embarrassment, or that she had gone there herself. And it seemed like everyone in the London congregation realized who the father actually was. Now George was engaged in a delicate and potentially explosive memory game as to what version of the truth he had told to whom. He had flat out lied to Caroline about George Oscar's paternity. It provided no protection from the rumors that were already rampant in England, in Nauvoo, and in New York, and the gossip began seeping into Caroline's psyche. And she endured it for the full 8 months that George spent on another mission in Boston.
I think it's interesting because they tried so hard to keep spiritual wifery quiet in England.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So many converts came over, never having heard of that. And then, unfortunately and devastatingly, we're kind of forced to, had no other option but to enter spiritual wifery. So if this was gossip in the conversation, in the congregation, he really couldn't say, well, this is a new doctrine, it's okay. He had to just kind of let it fly. And then it makes me think, why would the people in the congregation give anything he was saying any kind of credence if a Mormon missionary impregnated one of their, families there? It just seems he must have had to do a lot of spinning, like you said, to try to make it all okay.
Yes. You notice he left.
Yeah, that's the first thing you would have to do. The church is good about getting people out of Dodge. So
yeah, he left and he brought Mary and the infant with him. Now, so he leaves for Boston. And in those 8 months, little George Oscar grows up to be a toddler, not with very little effort. And by the middle of January 1843, with Mary and the child living in her house the entire time, Caroline was, as we're about to find out, she was literally nearly suicidal with anxiety, suspicion, and jealousy, made all the worse by a self-loathing that came with feeling disloyal because she simply could no longer bring herself to believe the story her husband had told her. And she could think of only one thing to do. Oh, by the way, I'm convinced that one of the people who was stoking her insecurity was Tom Lyne's wife, Mercy, because she had no intention of going to Nauvoo. And she had no intention of being a Mormon. And she was going to her sister-in-law and saying, look, George is in Boston. Tom has left me and our son Samuel here in New York. You can't possibly believe what he's telling you.
So at this point, George is somewhere else, and it's just Carolyn and Mary Connor and the child living at home.
And little George Oscar. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. That's like Emma Smith, so often at home with Eliza, the jealousies, the insecurities, these women. It was just devastating if you think about it.
Gaslighting comes to mind.
Yeah.
And she could think of only one thing to do. And I have to say it was ingenious in its politics. On January 15th, while George was still in Boston, Caroline posted a desperate, clandestine letter to Joseph Smith, but addressed it to Smith's wife, Emma Hale, thinking both that it would be less likely to be seen by the wrong people and that she would get a more sympathetic hearing from Joseph if Emma had read the letter first, because then Joseph couldn't hide it from her. Now, you can read this letter yourself in the Joseph Smith papers. We will put the link in the show, or Rebecca and Landon will put the link in the show notes. It's unfortunate that the first 4 pages of this letter are lost to history. We only have pages 4 through 8. There's very good reason to suspect that they were removed intentionally. At length, Mary Connor, her son George Oscar Adams, and George all came to live in Nauvoo and lived in close quarters with Heber C. Kimball. Someone wanted to keep the affair out of the public record of the Latter-day Saints. It could have been he or Emma Smith or Joseph or all 3. What is remarkable is that it now exists at all. Now, the last half of the letter gives us a fairly clear idea of the situation and of Caroline's state of mind. Extant page 4 begins mid-sentence. And Rebecca, would you bring Caroline Adams's words alive again for us, please?
Yeah, this is incredible. And these are only the last 4 pages. And I'm looking at the date around the middle of January, 1843. Is this when she sent the letter to Emma Smith? Okay. I'm telling you, the Joseph Smith papers, gosh, it's all in there. All of it. Just need a time to unlock it and somebody like Lee to look through it. So, all right, here we go. Carolyn writing to Emma. She says, starting mid-sentence, of the comfort of her husband, this is the first time in my life that I have had the least cause to think such a thing of him. He has always been to me a kind and devoted husband. Previous to my coming into the church, my health had been poor. He has never spared no expense nor pains to improve my health or add to my comfort. I know what his manner of life has been since. I have been his wife, and that has been 11 years. In his business, he has always had girls and his employees, sometimes 30 or more, and sometimes not more than 4 or 5. And he has been constantly with them, the girls, also far superior to the one I alluded to in the letter. And he has never been the man to take the least liberty with them. And the girl in the letter, of course, must be referring to Mary
Connor.
Yes. And with these girls, he has never taken the least liberty with them. He has never been a previous to his going to England, a man that has been particularly fond of female company. I really think he has enjoyed the society more of me more than females. And when he left home for England, deeply and keenly did I feel the loss of his society. He was the only person on earth that I could express my feelings to his keeping had I committed my happiness as it regards this world. And my only desire and prayer has been that the Lord would make him a faithful elder in his church. And when I look back on what has passed in the last 2 weeks, it appears like a horrid dream conjured up from the regions of darkness to hurry me to my grave. And it all, dear brother, I cannot express my feelings, but do not think I have written to you with the least hard feelings toward my husband. The Lord knows I have not, knowing it is your privilege to inquire of the Lord and know for a certainty whether he is guilty of what I suspect him or not, has induced me to write to you, feeling at the same time this is a certainty of his. I cannot write the word. I cannot produce a worse state of feeling than I now experience. And if it is so, he certainly is. Do you want me to stop there?
No, please.
Okay. Let's see. than I now experience. And if it is so, he certainly is not a fit man to minister in the things of God, for he has declared that the child is not his, and says if he had been guilty of anything of the kind, he should feel himself wholly unworthy of my love and esteem. But still, circumstances are so strong against him, I cannot help but suspect. There is now no one in the house think such a thing could be possible of him. My sister that has worked with him ever since we have been married says she could sooner think such a thing of him other than any other him. Sorry, could sooner think such thing of any other than him. I do not suppose all the world could make her believe such a thing of him. There is no one knows my suspicion of him, and there is no one knows my feelings. Sleep has left me. I retire at night when the rest of the family does, and I lay awake until the day breaks. My appetite has gone. I do not eat enough to keep a chicken alive, but still the awful state of excitement I am in keeps me up. But how long it will sustain me, I know not. Boy, she's tortured, absolutely tortured. I shall wait anxiously for an answer to this. I want advice from you, and I want comfort, if there is any for me this side of the grave. I know I hold my husband's fate as it regards this world in my own hands. I do not say it boasting, for he knows it too. For he told me before he left home that it is in my power to place him where he could never recover himself. But I do not wish to act unwisely in this thing. Do pray, inquire of the Lord, and find out if these things are so, and please write immediately, do not delay. And if you find him in transgression, let me entreat of you for my sake, the sake of my feelings, and the sake of what he has not been able to severe. If you write to him, I expect, if it is so, he will be summoned immediately to Nauvoo. And if you do summon him, please do it in as kind a manner as the case will admit of. He does not know nor think of such a thing as my writing to you. Pray do not let him know it. How? I have now one very particular favor to ask. That is that you let no one see this letter, nor let them know the contents, for it is written back here. I really do not think I could live through it. I am very willing this letter should be brought forward when the affair is settled there, but I entreat of you not to make it public for my sake, for I have always idolized my husband and felt as secure about any such thing as it was possible for any woman to feel. For his example and teaching has always been as pure as ice in regard to such things, both before he came into the church and since. And I should soon expect to see the earth ascending to the heavens, as I should expect to write such a letter as I am now writing. Why the Lord suffered such a thing to come upon me, I cannot tell. Oh my gosh, this is difficult. If he should prove to be innocent, it would be the happiest day of my life. If the child is his, I think his object in bringing her on here was that I would pity her and adopt the child and thing before forever buried. He knew my standing in society was such that if I did this, he would never be suspected. But I am a person that never acts hastily in regard to anything. But he is a different turn altogether. I know his kind, benevolent feeling toward individuals has led him great lengths before. And I think perhaps that it is the case now. When he left for Boston, he begged me to be cheerful and happy and said the father of the child would come to Nauvoo and then it would all be settled and I would be satisfied. Mr. Adams wished me to go to Boston with him, but I excused myself by saying I could not leave home at present. He then made me promise I would come in 3 or 4 weeks. I will just say the child does not look the least like him, nor has it one feature like him. And as to the mother, she glories in her own shame. She says she has got the boy and she is proud of him. She says this to my sister. Again, I entreat you to keep this letter a secret. He will not be surprised at your sending for him to come up there, for he had told me he expected the report would reach there and that he would be sent for. And if he was, he would take me with him. I think if he is sent for, he will go forthwith, and I likewise think he will confess the whole. I shall anxiously and patiently wait your answer to this letter. I sometimes almost make up my mind to leave my home unbeknownst to anyone and bury myself in the world where I should never look upon a face I have ever seen before. But I will await your answer and abide by your counsel. If you send for Mr. Adams to come to Nauvoo and you think it is wisdom to advise him to bring me with him, I am ashamed of this letter, but I feel you will excuse all mistakes and pardon all omissions when you think of the state of feeling it was written in. Accept my best wishes for yourself and your family, Caroline Adams. And on the outside of the envelope, it says, Mr. Smith, please let no one read this but yourself. I think it best to direct this letter to your wife, thinking it will go safer, and she will hand it to you and prevent anyone seeing it but yourself. Now that is brilliant. That is a brilliant strategy.
And scene.
And scene. There it is.
Yeah, I think if this ever became a play or a screenplay, that this would be the climactic monologue.
It would. And again, I have to agree with Landon's point. This could have been something out of the Secret Lives of Mormon Wives. There were scenes like this. Is he cheating? Was he with that girl? Somebody tell me. My friend said he wasn't. My other friend said he was. This is exactly that, if you understood what I was reading. And she's begging for help from the prophet.
And beautifully rendered. Thank you, Rebecca, very much. So meanwhile, blissfully unaware of Caroline's letter, George wrote to Smith from Boston, beseeching him to ignore future rumors about his conduct with women. And in the middle of March, Smith, having read Caroline's letter, responded to Adams's letter by ordering him back to Nauvoo to answer to charges of adultery, exactly what Caroline had asked him to do. So Adams races back to New York, and from there speeds his entire brood, Caroline, George Oscar, and Mary Connor, from New York to Nauvoo. And we do not know exactly why Joseph Smith forgave Adams in his considerable transgression of fathering a child out of wedlock with a parishioner and reinstated him as an elder. However, we can make an educated guess. We know in the hindsight of history that polygamy was being practiced in Nauvoo by the highest officials among Joseph Smith's counselors. Adam's mistake there was therefore not in taking another wife and having a son by her. It was in doing so without prior permission, without the sanction of the 12. Now, weirdly, paterfamilias Heber C. Kimball knew perfectly well who Mary Connor. He and her father, Henry, appear in his journal back in London only 3 years before. After all, Kimball knew what her relation to her was to her son and to Caroline and to George. All indications were that Kimball did not share this information with his family, least of all his daughter, Helen. To them, Mary Connor was Miss Adams, a sister of George and George Oscar's aunt. Now, the other player in the scene who knew perfectly well that Mary Connor was not George's sister was, of course, actor Tom Line, brother-in-law to both George and Caroline. But George was apparently successful in maintaining the ruse that Mary was simply a baptized saint who had gotten herself into trouble, and the Adamses were being generous in taking the child as their own. And Tom fell for it. Hook, line, see what I did there? And sinker. And as lead actor and director of the troupe, he had no time or patience for gossip. So Line willingly deluded himself about polygamy in Nauvoo, and there were powerful reasons for him to believe George's false narrative. At first, Line must have believed Adam's lies out of unadorned family loyalty, even though his wife Mercy, George's sister, whom he had left behind in New York, and subsequently divorced because she wouldn't join the Latter-day Saints, must have seen through George's thin story to the unsavory truth behind it. But why would Line have sided with his brother-in-law and not with his own wife? Well, because George got to him first, in Nauvoo, while Mercy was still back in Manhattan, and reinforced the story again and again and again between mid-April and early June. Moreover, Caroline herself was dutifully telling Line the same story. They were doing God's work in saving face for Mary Connor by raising George Oscar as their own child. It would take Line 7 years to come to terms with the fact that he had been duped by Adams. However, to the end of his long life, he refused to believe that his support of Joseph Smith had been misguided. He maintained, with the later reorganized LDS, that Smith had nothing to do with polygamy. Ultimately, that denial served Line to curry favor with Joseph Smith's son and namesake, Joseph Smith III, who was to preside over the RLDS in opposition to Brigham Young. But from the spring of 1843 through the productions of 1844 and years afterward, Lyne simply chose to believe Adams because Adams was his former brother-in-law, had converted him to the faith, was his fellow actor, and had remained his friend. Now, I
think maybe the show must go on, right? If you stir that pot, none of the women can be in the play because everybody's like, you're his wife and her wife. But what about that baby? The show must go on, right? Above everything else. Drama without drama.
Exactly. Now, as the review of a friend of the drama suggests, the run of the newly organized line in Adams' troupe in Nauvoo had an inauspicious beginning. The advertised debut of Wednesday, April 24th was postponed by weather. But the surviving broadside lists Miss Goodnell in the role of Cora and Mrs. Young as Elvira, presumably Brigham's wife Clarissa, was his only public spouse out of the four he had married by April of 1844. However, by curtain time, Clarissa Young had demurred. She backed out. And Helen Kimball reported that the part of Elvira was now occupied by Mrs. Adams, which can only mean that when the company lost Brigham Young's wife, George Adams, saw his opportunity and browbeat Caroline into taking the part. Caroline, in turn, had no interest in having anything to do with acting, and still less in appearing on the same stage with Mary Connor, her rival plural wife. But she agreed, likely with gritted teeth, much to her later humiliation and regret. Now, on the night of the actual performance of the play, Friday the 26th, a friend of the drama returned. And his review betrayed an in-depth knowledge of Nauvoo's leaders, including Joseph Smith, all of whom he knew by sight. But the reviewer revealed something more that night. He was current on the gossip, and he was intent on naming names. And so he said, the part of Alonzo was sustained by Elder Erastus Snow, a worthy preacher of the gospel, part of Elvira, taken by Mrs. Adams, wife of the Reverend Gentleman. We recall this as Caroline Adams. And that of Cora by his sister, Miss Adams, who we know as Mary Connor. In justice to the ladies, I must say they performed their part extremely well, particularly Cora. It's said again and again in all of the evidence that Mary Connor was a really talented actress. We cannot help from mentioning that Alonzo's child was one of G.J. Adams' spiritual babies by Miss 6 asterisks. Cora, portrayed by Miss Goodnell. Miss 6 asterisk, also portraying the same part. Oh, shame, where is thy blush? And there it was. The reviewer had heard the gossip that revealed Mary Connor's name, right down to the number of letters in Connor. He knew who George Oscar's parents were, but he did not make the connection that solves this part of the mystery. He did not put it together that the mythical Miss Adams and Miss 6 asterisks, George Oscar's mother, were in fact all the same person. And there was yet another layer to this confusing maze of assumed names. The poster for Pizarro advertised that the role of Cora was Miss Goodnell. Now, how do we know that there was not another Miss Goodnell? Well, no one has ever looked for this Miss Goodnell and found a trace of her beyond this poster. There was no Goodnell family in Nauvoo. Go to the database, look for them. They're not there. Go to ancestry.com, go to familysearch.com. There was no Goodnell family in Nauvoo. There's no evidence that a professional actress named Goodnell ever existed. As recently as 2004, a master's thesis about the plays performed in Nauvoo casually remarked that, quote, the identity of Miss Goodnell is unknown, end quote. But Miss Goodnell's identity is right under our noses, and a friend to the drama missed it. Knew the gossip, knew that a woman named Mary Connor was mother to the toddler George Oscar. But a friend of the drama had not made the connection that the woman everyone referred to as Miss Adams and was advertised as Miss Goodnell was in fact Mary Connor. What no one was ready for was the fact that the pseudonym had a pseudonym. The trail of evidence leads to the conclusion that Miss Adams had herself assumed a stage name. Mary Connor was not only Miss Adams, Mary Connor was also Miss Goodnell, and my own conclusion is that George J. Adams wanted to bury Mary Connor's identity so deeply that he gave his plural wife and fictitious sister her own stage name for the purposes of the Nauvoo performances. And I further have a strong suspicion as a theater historian that the very name Goodnell is a kind of theater history play on words with which George Adams would have been familiar. I want to caution that this is only a guess and it could be wildly wrong, but it speaks to a legendary knowledge of the English theater some 2 centuries before Nauvoo. During the English Civil War, the Puritans had closed all the playhouses in 1649, and when King Charles II was restored to the throne in the 1660s, he had the theaters rebuilt and legitimized theater going permanently. Charles II also introduced a novelty in keeping with his upbringing in France, where attending the theater had been a favorite pastime of his. He introduced for the first time in England the convention of female actresses. In Shakespeare's time, all of the women's parts had been played by men in drag. This was a standard practice in France, but in England it had never been done before. And Charles's favorite actress was a woman named Nell Gwynn. She became the king's favorite mistress and the mother of 2 of his royal children out of wedlock. And on his deathbed, Charles famously implored his brother and brief successor, James II, let not poor Nellie starve. And James honored the wish and paid off most of Nell Gwyn's debts, gave her an annual pension of £1,500 for the 2.5 years remaining in her own life. The Restoration comedies of that period used wordplay to name its characters. Sir Giles Overreach, Mrs. Malaprop, Lydia Languish. I have no more evidence than my own hunch, and I am content to be proven wrong if an historical Miss Goodnell was not Mary Connor emerges from evidence we haven't found yet. But it feels to me as though the stage name Miss Goodnell might be George Adams's play on Goodnell. That is Goodnell Gwynn, the English actress and mother of some of King Charles's children, just as Mary Connor was mother of George's firstborn child. Again, I'm completely open to being proven wrong on this. It's just a hunch, and if anybody has contrary evidence, I'm perfectly happy to concede the point. But I think that George Adams thought that he was being clever by giving Mary Connor this stage name right under the noses of his wife, Caroline, and Tom Lyne, who was still clueless that polygamy was being practiced.
Yeah, it's like hiding in plain sight. I can see that.
That's what I think anyway. But that cleverness could only go so far, and the review of Pizarro lit a slowly burning fuse to the explosion that would occur when his wife Caroline realized that the truth of George's paternity had been exposed. The rest of the review seemed like denouement after that climactic revelation, but it offered some of the best information available about just how amateur the affair was, how inept Adams's acting, and how deeply Lyne was frustrated by this all. Something remarkable did happen over that weekend between the 2 performances that a friend of the drama attended. If only a friend of the drama had known what happened behind the scenes between Friday, when George Adams said, we have an illness in the cast, we will present Therese on Monday. When he would return to see another performance, he would have had a great deal more to write about. Because over the weekend, Caroline must have heard someone talking about the fact that everyone knew the true situation with the Adams clan living at the Kimball house. And there's another eyewitness that weekend, and it was, again, Helen Kimball, In a later memoir, she related the following, which Rebecca will now read. This is reading number 4.
Perfect. And I'm trying to figure out how old she was just barely, let's see, if she was born in 28, how old is she here? She's just barely become the plural wife.
By 1844, she's 15.
Yeah, she's just barely become the plural wife of Joseph Smith. Okay. Right. So Helen Mar Kimball says, in the spring of 1844, during the dramatic season, George J. Adams with his wife and sister stayed with us. But my father was at home, which made quite a difference because if we remember from the last letter, father wasn't at home and mother was working too hard. I was just at the age to enjoy such amusements, which made time pass very agreeably. Miss Adams was a fine young lady and very gifted as an actress. In fact, was quite a star. Though a new beginner, like all the rest, with the exception of Line, he spent much of his time at our house, as they were old friends, and he was a Mormon. Interesting.
Thank you. So Helen's account confirmed several facts: that her father, Heber C. Kimball, was home that spring of 1844, that her father was still maintaining in the house the fiction that Mary Connor was George Adams' sister, as Helen believed, Miss Adams, that Line was regarded as the only professional actor in the group, and that Line spent a lot of time at the Kimball house as he and Adams were old friends. You notice that she doesn't say they were brothers-in-law. That's because Mercy Line, whom Line had divorced, was never mentioned. Line was acknowledged as a baptized Latter-day Saint. Yeah. Old friends, not brothers-in-law. Miss Adams was not Mercy Adams. So Miss Adams could not have been Mercy Adams Line, the other sister, whose professional stage name was Mrs. Line. Of Caroline, Helen wrote the following. Rebecca, please read reading number 5.
Yes, so this is George's wife, Caroline. Mrs. Adams was a dignified and quite a distinguished looking woman and made a fine appearance upon the stage, but she played only one night, took the part of Countess in The Orphan of Geneva, and thought herself so disguised that no one would recognize her.
Just a pause. What reason would Caroline have had to disguise herself? Helen continued. Rebecca, please read number 6.
But when Mrs. Adams found that she was known, she could not be prevailed upon to go on again. And as the play was to be repeated the next night, they were in a terrible dilemma, not knowing what to do, as we had returned home and it was then near midnight. So she said no, she opted out.
She opted out because she had read the review with the 6 asterisks in it that exposed George as practicing plural wifery, that George Oscar was not Caroline's son, as she had been telling everyone in Nauvoo. So she was humiliated.
Yeah.
With our present knowledge of what was going on, knowledge that the teenaged Helen Mar Kimball did not have, the cause of Caroline Adams' distress becomes obvious. Her worst fears had been realized. She had accepted out of duty the lie George had told her about George Oscar's paternity. Now the ugliest possible gossip had confirmed the truth she had always suspected, the anxiety that she had confided to Joseph Smith through Emma. The child Caroline was raising, George Oscar Adams, was not only Mary Connor's, but George's. Caroline resolved that she would maintain appearances for her adopted son's sake, but by no means would she appear on stage with her rival to be ridiculed further. He was done with the onstage charade. So
and that's pretty dramatic. I mean, to leave a production, right? And it's midnight and they have nobody that can play the part or knows the part. And you also have to think that as a woman in those days, you do what you're told, you do what the men tell you to do. So you've got lines, you've got her husband both saying, you've got to do this, I'm guessing. And she's like, no, it has to take something pretty dramatic to have a woman say, I'm not, you know what I mean? So that tracks with what she would have found out. She was probably hysterical and just said, no way.
Exactly. And as you point out, Line and Adams now had an enormous problem on their hands. And then at midnight, and in the urgency of the moment, they turned to 15-year-old Helen to play the title character in Thérèse, or The Orphan of Geneva, in Caroline's stead on Monday night. Rebecca, please read number 7.
This is just insanity. She's become the plural wife of Joseph Smith. This is insanity.
Yes.
I'm sorry, Landon. Don't you think this is insanity?
Oh, this is great. This would make a great Hulu series.
This tops Secret Lives of Mormon Wives. Yeah. I'm not kidding.
And everyone says they're not Mormons.
Mormons have been doing this for 200 years. That's right. This is nothing new. I can see this as a scene where they're like, I'm not being in the play anymore because he's your baby. You've got to know who will play the part. Oh, let's pick Joseph Smith's new wife. This is just nuts. Okay. So Helen Marr, the 15-year-old, Kimball says, one of them proposed my taking the part, Adam or Line. And you can just see this as a midnight Hail Mary, right? They're looking around the room going, well, what about you? You know, and the women and all set in flattering and teasing me to take it. But I was a timid girl of 15 and frightfully bashful. And a plural wife. That's very telling right there. She's this shy little girl. What the heck is she doing as a plural wife?
Except that nobody knows she's a plural wife.
I know, but I'm just saying.
She's not only that, but she can't tell anybody.
She can't tell. I know, but I'm just saying for her herself to say, I'm frightfully shy. And you know what the reality is, where a predator has coerced her. And she's saying herself, I'm a shy girl. That's disturbing, aside from anything to do with the play.
But if she has any idea of what's going on here between Mrs. Adams and Miss Adams, she's got to be going, well, I'm Miss Adams to Emma Smith. I'm in the exact same boat as she is.
Yeah. I don't know what she realized or knew.
I think if she had any idea, she wouldn't be calling her Miss Adams.
Yeah, that's probably true too.
Correct.
Yeah. Wow. All right. And the idea of taking the part, so dignified a part, was, to my mind, utterly absurd, having only been upon the stage in 2 plays. First, as one of the virgins in Pizarro, and another simple part. But all my excuses were useless, and I was fairly pressed into service. Adams said encouragingly, I will help you out. I bet you will. And as Line was leaving, he said, now study the part over good tonight, and then retire and sleep on it, and you'll nearly know it in the morning, which direction I followed, and having a quick memory, was able to repeat every word at the rehearsal.
Thank you.
So crazy.
It's nuts. So Monday came, and Line held a dress rehearsal afternoon with their new star, Miss Kimball. But once again, there were complications. Rebecca, please read number 8.
All right. Helen says, when before an audience, I was so frightened that I remembered very little. My wits nearly deserted me, but Adams was true to his promise, and by his readiness assisted me to recover from my confusion. Though he was never up in his own part, he was never at a loss for a substitute in every emergency, but which for anything but pleasing to those who depended on him for their cue. So he knew everyone's lines.
Except his own.
Except his own. That's it. He could never do his own part, but he knew everybody else's.
Right. We remember that he relied on the prompter. According to that. Yeah. So for George J. Adams, improvisation was the solution to all difficulties. If others were depending on him, that was their problem. Unfortunately, that would be the case not just on stage, but also in life, particularly with Mary Connor. And the performance was only hours away. A friend of the drama was again in the audience to witness George's latest bit of improv. And so he makes the excuse that, we're going to have it later because there's an sickness in the family. Of course, the sickness in the family was Caroline's refusal to take the stage in the same cast with Mary Connor, now that her husband had been exposed as a polygamist and she knew that George had lied about George Oscar's paternity. I mean, by this time, Tom Line was having fits. His cast was falling apart. He had intended to perform Damon and Pythias, presumably with Caroline Adams as Damon's wife and George Oscar as the child, but now Caroline was lost to the company, and she may also have refused to allow the child to be part of the evening. And Line must have feared that the largesse of Joseph Smith was in danger of being withdrawn, and with it would go all hope of establishing his theatrical foothold in Nauvoo. He had to think fast So for his benefit on Wednesday, he resolved to substitute Douglas, one of his reliable roles that required more line and less everybody else. Even so, he was short-handed. He had no actress to stand in the part of Lady Randolph. He may again have turned to Helen Kimball, hoping to prevail on her. And his state of mind was, as he waited to perform that evening, can only be imagined, but it spilled out into ill temper at the audience as the evening wore on. And a friend of the drama was present and reported, let's see. Let's stay
can
on
I
that
ask one
picture
question?
line.
So that
Sure.
performance that Helen Mar Kimball was supposed to do, because it all went sideways, that never happened. They canceled it. Is that right?
They
and
did.
Then Wednesday
that's
night, they're trying again because they're trying to raise money for Joseph Smith. Okay.
That's correct. That's correct. So now a friend of the drama was here on this evening, and he reported, on Wednesday evening, I repaired to the Nauvoo Theater at an early hour when we were informed that the profits of the evening were for Elder Lyne's benefit. This was a standard practice to have a benefit performance for one of the actors. Lyne was taking his standard benefit. That was the only time that actors got paid, was when they did a benefit. And that instead of Damon and Pythias, we were to have the tragedy of Douglas. At the close of the first act, amidst the deafening cheers, a few hisses were audibly heard. Okay, Lyne, short on sleep, having to deliver a play that's not actually ready, having to be up in a part that he hadn't studied for a long time, worried to death that he's going to lose his stature with Joseph Smith. Elder Lyne immediately made his appearance and cried that he was sorry to apologize to the audience, but he was accustomed to performing in large theaters. And if any person was dissatisfied with the performance so far, they could go to the door and have their 2 bits returned to them. It has been currently reported that the reverend gentleman behind the curtain flew into a holy rage and swore that he would perform no more in the place of Hist again, and that therefore we should lose the services of so distinguished an actor.
So he started insulting the audience.
He lost his cool. He started insulting the audience. By the way, and I hope all of you will have a chance to go to Nauvoo at some point, and visit this room. The room is tiny. The room in the first floor of the Masonic Hall / Cultural Hall doesn't seat more than 150 people. It is tiny. And so it was an insult to his stature, he felt, that he should be reduced to playing in a room that small to begin with, and then to be hissed by his audience. It was just too much. And the last thing that happened here, about the middle of the second act, Brother Lyne came on the stage and requested the privilege of the audience for Lady Randolph to read her part from the book, as she had forgotten it. That was clearly Helen. So, that's what happened. And what happened after that, and in the interest of time, these are more graphics that we can go into at another time. But Lyne took what actors he could assemble, toured up and down the Mississippi for about 2 weeks and returned to Nauvoo in early June.
And were some of the apostles among those actors that he took up and down?
Good question. They were not. Okay. This is what Hiram Clausen, who was 17 years old at the time, and the comedian of the company, and later became both Brigham Young's son-in-law and the manager of the Salt Lake Theater, recalled the following. Besides a small comic part in Bizarro, I was chosen to let down the holy fire at the command of the high priest, this is Brigham Young in his non-speaking role, which part I successfully performed to the great delight of myself and audience. It was immense. Miss Adams, even Hiram thinks it's Miss Adams, whom we now know to be Mary Connor and Miss Goodnell, took the ladies' part. The next part was the stranger, with Thomas A. Lyne as the stranger. I had the comic part and also recited between acts. A traveling company was formed which gave performances back and forth down the river, in which I was billed as the young American comedian. Needless to say, the members of the 12 in the cast, that is, Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, George A. Smith, and Erastus Snow, drew the line at this traveling and withdrew from the company. At this time, concluded Hiram Clausen, Thomas A. Line advised me to come to Philadelphia and study for the stage, but the prophet said no. So there we have it.
And this is June of 1844.
This is June 1844. So we see what's coming. Because we know what's coming.
Because I think that's the thing. We know, that the martyrdom happens on June 27th, 1844. And I think all of us think, that Nauvoo is just this hotbed and that people are only thinking about what's happening and the tensions. And yet we find out they're attending plays every other night and half of them are in the play. And there's a traveling company. And the apostles, of course, weren't allowed to do that. But it's a different perspective. What don't you think, Landon?
Well, they were attending plays, but they were attending plays trying to raise funds to get Joseph out of trouble that he'd gotten himself into. And possibly, was it to get him out of trouble legally, or was it his presidential campaign they were trying to fund? I think you said
it was legal. Yeah, it wasn't for this part was not. By June, he had actually withdrawn from the race.
So you can see he's in kind of deep trouble, and that's why they're having these plays is to try to get him out of the trouble that he's gotten himself into. So
yeah. So to conclude, the Line Adams Company of Actors returned to Nauvoo sometime around the first week of June, but there was no time left to build on what they had achieved with their theatrical company. Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram were assassinated on June 27th, and chaos ensued. Line and Adams were sent east to bear the news to Hiram Kimball, who had left on an East Coast mission, and to Brigham Young, who was in Boston. And in the chaos, Mary Connor, Miss Six Asterisks herself, she vanished. Her various known aliases are all lost to the historical record. The last clear sight of her before the turn of the century had been her positive review as Miss Goodnell from the Burlington, Iowa newspaper at the end of May. Mary now found herself over 4,000 miles from her home city, London, the prophet of her church murdered, in fear for her life, her celestial husband pretending she was his sister, and without legal rights to her own son, who in turn, now at the age that he was, must have believed that Caroline Adams was his mother, because that's what she and George were telling everyone. George was then assigned to Iowa Territory, after which he testified, I then came down to St. Louis in the fall of 1845, where I remained with my family during the winter. During this time at St. Louis, I did not teach or preach. Interesting. I held the office of an elder as I do now. In the spring of 1846, I went with my family to Cincinnati, where I preached and taught the doctrines of the Latter-day Saints. I've discovered what might be evidence of Mary Connor's eventual fate in the British census of 1901, back in the Connors neighborhood of Shoreditch, London. She'd been born there in August of 1919. This record says Mary Ann Connor, age 81 at the time of enumeration on March 31st, 1901, born in Shoreditch, occupation charwoman, meaning cleaning lady. She was a pauper. It is unknown whether she ever saw her son George Oscar again, or whether the boy ever learned who his biological mother was. Aside from Hiram Clausen, who would live until 1912, if this is indeed our Mary Connor, she's likely to have been the last surviving member of Line's original Nauvoo troop. This Mary Ann Connor in London declared herself a widow. As George J. Adams had died in 1880, perhaps Mary still imagined him as her husband, celestial or otherwise. We will likely never know. But what we can do is remember her journey and finally give her her name and her place in history back to her. And that is our solved mystery for tonight.
That is incredible. And I do feel there's a way to figure this out, because 23andMe, DNA research, if any of these names sound familiar to anybody, are you a descendant of, this child? You could trace that back. And if the line parts at a certain time where you are not Carolyn's side of the family, you could tell if it was somebody else. So somebody out there's got to know it can be done. This is amazing. Wow. What do you think, Landon? What an incredible story. I felt like we sat through a play. We're part of a play. I feel like applauding.
I want to know if, was she ever sealed to George Adams?
Oh.
This is before sealings.
But right, posthumously.
But could they go back? Did anyone ever go back and seal her to him?
I'm getting on, on Family Search tomorrow. Maybe right now, in fact. Let's end.
Well, no, I've been there, and it's no. And the reason that it's no is that George Adams does not. Well, he in the succession crisis in the summer of 1844, he backs James Jesse Strang.
Right.
Oh, he becomes a Strangite. Okay.
He became He became not only a Strangite, he became Jesse Strang's right-hand man. And when he pulled the same thing again and took when he took his third wife, he still had George Oscar with him, and he married a woman named Louisa Prey. And Louisa Prey was not someone he was actually married to, because he was still married to Caroline, but Caroline was on the East Coast. But what he told James Jesse Strang was, "Oh, my wife Caroline is dead." And that got back to Caroline, who wrote, "I am most certainly not dead."
Wow.
Or if she had,
Was she still standing by him, or had she just taken off?
No.
At that point, she'd left.
At that time, she was very ill with cancer.
Oh, okay.
He was fully expecting her to die.
Okay.
And she didn't. And 2 months after that, she did.
So
but
it's kind of like Samuel Clemens. Rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated.
I was about to say exactly that. Yes, rumors of Caroline's death were greatly exaggerated. After that, he formed this church. He took 152 people from Maine to Israel to try to establish a millennial colony to wait for the Lord to come back.
George Adams did this.
Yes.
On the instructions of Strang, or just on his own?
Oh, no. Strang had been assassinated.
Oh, by then. Okay.
Before.
So George Adams on his own goes to Israel, starts a group there waiting for the second coming.
Yes.
Okay. It just can't get any stranger.
A lot of them starved to death.
Because and they weren't planting crops or doing anything because they thought that the end was coming. Okay.
No.
Of course.
And Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, writes The Innocents Abroad, and he was on great book, read it again. He's on the boat that the survivors of George Adams's failed colony took back from Palestine to the United States, and he writes about them in detail.
Is this before he goes to Salt Lake and meets Brigham Young and is given his Book of Mormon?
No, it's after.
This is after.
Okay,
So it's been a long time since I've read Innocents Abroad. Well, and I know that we're all talking about books and how you have to read them recently to be able to even comment on them. But I do not remember that part. I'm going to have to go back. And so was George on the boat also, or just the survivors?
George was on the boat, I believe. Don't quote me on any of that, because I'm doing all of this from memory, and this is being recorded, and it's now going to be out.
We invite anybody
to look into the ether. forever.
Yes. No, we'll give a caveat and we'll say this is how we think we remember it. But I remember when you described this to me over the summer, I did look him up and he did have the colony in Israel. So, but you're saying you can't remember exactly the Samuel Clements on the same boat. So
I don't exactly remember that. What I do know is that Adams died in 1880 and he's buried in Philadelphia.
It just can't get weirder. And then
can't get
Lions.
Any stranger.
Oh, what? Yeah. It can't get any stranger? Is that what you said? Any stranger? Landon had to get another dad joke in there. And then, of course, Lions, as we've talked about in other podcasts and on Mormonism Live, he went on to Salt Lake. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Line. Yeah.
Line. Yes.
Lines.
Yeah.
Lines.
What happened there, again, very briefly, because we can go into more detail later.
Right.
Hoping to be back. He Line wanted after he was excommunicated on the East Coast by William B. Smith, who himself was a shady character. He was so disillusioned by all of this that his second wife, who was Marianne Hess, the daughter of the bishop of Philadelphia named Peter Hess, who had been in Nauvoo. Line courted her in 1844. He was promised to her. Line became a Rigdonite evangelist, and then Sidney Rigdon's movement collapsed.
Fell apart. Yeah, became the Bickertonite.
He went to Britain. He comes back from Britain. He marries Marianne, and then they don't know what to do, so they go ahead, and there's George Adams again, and recruits them for Strang. And so they spend up until 1849, Peter Hess is a Strangite bishop, and Line and Adams are actually doing performances in Baltimore, raising money for the Strangite cause. And then Strang, it's revealed, is also a polygamist, and he has one of his plural wives is his secretary, who is dressing in drag as a man, as a secretary named Charlie Douglas. And so everything falls apart then. In 1852, he's killed. He's assassinated. It's Strang. And Line, unfortunately, Marianne Line dies of pleurisy in 1852, same year as his friend Junius Brutus Booth dies, and Line leaves the East Coast and never returns. And he is around the Midwest. He marries Carrie Cogswell. They go to Milwaukee. They spend some years there. They go to Chicago. They go to Pittsburgh. From Pittsburgh, they go to Denver, and that's where they meet Jared W. Carter, whose father was one of the originators of the Danites. He's in the DNC. You can look him up. And he runs away with Carter. And Line hears that Brigham Young is building a theater in Salt Lake City.
Yeah, I knew he'd end up in Salt Lake. Yep.
He ends up in Salt Lake City. None too pleased that the Carters show up there too. And he spends the last 32 years of his life in Salt Lake City.
Because now, if I'm correct, Line's first wife ran away with one of the Carters, and now they're all there.
The third one.
The third one. Okay, the third one. Yeah. It's actors. It's actors. Dicey in the theater world. Well, this is just crazy. What I love about it is it's such an interesting story, and you can take it in superficially, just look at all this, the actor and the play and this, but there's real information in there, in just the day-to-day dealings of the theater troupe. There's real access to information that you're not getting through other channels, and that's what I love. That glimpse into Helen Mar Kimball. I bet 90% of our viewers have never read anything like that she wrote as a young person at the very same time. It's fascinating, and it's off the radar and off the grid. Don't you agree, Landon?
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. I love your stories. You just sit there and go, this, when I thought Mormonism couldn't get any weirder, it always gets weirder.
And I love it. All right. Well, I think we've handled it. And like I said, there's so many tangents here that we could go off on for many other episodes, and we'll definitely have Lee back. Do you have any, as we end here, any final takeaways from this story? I mean, it's so interesting to think of you researching all this without, what we have in our mind as the Mormon narrative. It's a very clear narrative that we were raised with. As post-Mormons now, we've gone off the path. We see these other things, but it's not as clear, I think, as you can see just going through the research like that with these characters who are real people. I mean, what were some of your takeaways as we end here? Because I know we're getting up at that time.
We are, but my favorite historian, Douglas Archer, said, "We ignore chronology at our peril." Whenever we are unclear about theology, or we're unclear about what's fabulation and what's actual fact, or we're unclear about people's relationships, all we need to do is dig deeply enough to find out what happened when. And it will lead us to the place that we want to be as far as whether something really happened or not. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm continuing to do this work, because I want to know, not just because some of them are my relatives, but because I think it has value to give people who have been erased their voice, particularly people like Helen Mar Kimball, who, by the way, all of her writings are in this book called A Woman's View. It's a wonderful book. Please find it. Or people like, Charlotte Haven, and especially people like Mary Connor, to whom immeasurable damage was done. Okay. I think she deserves her day, and she deserves to be remembered. And she deserves to have her name spoken.
Yeah. And you do this. You bring people back to life. Yes. You bring people back to life, and you want people, you encourage people to know more and to dig into these stories, even within their own families. You may think you know the history, and I've had experience with this. It only takes a little scratching of the surface with so much available now. You may say, oh, my parents did all the genealogy. They did a certain kind of genealogy, but the histories and the things that are available now, I guarantee you, if you dig into this era, the things that happened, it is stranger than fiction. As Landon said, it can't get any weirder. Make Nauvoo weird again. So seriously, I can't believe I'm here advocating genealogy and family history, but I was raised by genealogists. It's in my blood. I've always been more interested than in the names, temple work, but the histories of the people and what they were doing and the histories that are off the beaten path were always fascinating to me. So you're an inspiration to everybody to just dig in and look through those Joseph Smith papers. I mean, it's crazy out there. So any last thoughts, Landon, or we will finally wrap up and we'll have Lee back on another day, because I guarantee probably a month from now, Lee will call and go, you will not believe what I found. And I'll say, bring it on. All right. Bring it on the podcast. What do you think, Landon? Any last words?
I think we need to have a Secret Life of Mormon Wives 1840 edition, the prequel to the modern.
That's right. Secret Lives of Mormon Wives 1840. Yep, that's it. Oh, and I think maybe Lee had to duck out now, so we'll just say goodbye. This has been incredible. Please comment and let us know. Were you aware of any of this craziness? Did you even know there was a theater company in Nauvoo? This is just amazing, and all the information that came out because of that theater company, everything very well documented. We appreciate Lee so much and all of his research and everything that he brings to Mormonish. It's wonderful. So please comment and let us know what you thought of the episode. We just have so much fun with Lee. Please like and subscribe to Mormonish Podcast, and if you'd like to be made aware of when new episodes come out, you can hit that notification bell and it'll let you know when a new one drops. If you would like to help financially support Mormonish Podcast, we always have links in the show notes to Donor Box, where you can set up a monthly donation or just make a donation. And we absolutely love and appreciate all of you that do show your support. It just makes our day. I can't even tell you how much we just appreciate you guys and love you guys, our viewers and listeners. If you're interested in Mormonish merch, we have all kinds of cool stuff. Landon always seems to be able to pull out a mug. He had pulled out a sweatshirt the other day that said, I don't even know when you got that sweatshirt, Landon. It says Mormonish on it. Anyway, he's got all kinds of fun stuff. You can check out those links in our show notes, and we'll just say goodbye from the theater and from Mormonish Podcast. Thanks, Lee. Thanks, Landon. We will see you all next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Mormonish. We really appreciate our listeners and would love to hear from you if you have a story you'd like to share. You can email us at mormonishpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, mormonishpodcast.org. And don't forget to look for us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Keep joyful, everybody.